Well, to begin with, Russian tamizdat was really important for me throughout my entire life. But, well, we had our own tamizdat, Lithuanian tamizdat. And it has a very, very long and, I would say, very honorable tradition. In the year 1863, Lithuanians, together with Poles, had an uprising against the Tsarist rule. And after that uprising, there was an idea by some Slavophilic thinkers to take Lithuanian peasants out of the Polish influence of the Polish nobles, and to bring them closer to Russian culture. Well, the language has not much in common with Russian language. It's very different. I always say it is as different as English and Gaelic. So the Irish people, as a rule, did not preserve their language, but we did. And the Tsarist authorities were helpful in that. Because after the year 1863, they had that was not a law, but that was a sort of a spoken decision by Tsar Alexander II to change Lithuanian alphabet. It was a Latin alphabet, same as Polish, which naturally made Lithuanians close to Polish culture. The other element which made Lithuanians closer to Polish culture was Catholicism. So Lithuanians had to be Russified, brought to Russian culture. There was even the theory that in the 13th, 14th century, they were virtually Russian-speaking people. And they were spoiled by Poles, brought into the Polish area of influence, and they must go back. They must go back to their East Slavic roots. Well, for that, the alphabet was changed. Printing books in Latin letters was banned, was forbidden, and with some exceptions, Russian Academy of Sciences could, with a special permission, publish Lithuanian books, for example, collections of folklore in Latin alphabet. But those books could not be sold in Lithuania proper, only in other parts of the Russian Empire. They were not numerous, but they did exist. Jan Baudouin de Courtenay, who was the greatest linguist of the period, was very instrumental in that. He helped to print books in Latin alphabet, in Lithuanian language, the collections of folklore, very significant collections of folklore, in Kazan, of all places, today's Tatar Republic. And of course they leaked to Lithuania proper as well. People simply bought them in Moscow or St. Petersburg or Kazan, if you want, and brought them to Lithuania. But the letter of law was that they cannot be published in Lithuanian region, and they cannot be sold in Lithuanian region. Then all other books, including textbooks, including elementaries, including prayer books, all had to be printed in Lithuanian language, but in Russian Cyrillic letters. That, well, some of those books survived. They also were not numerous. They look very funny, I would say, very strange. very strange, and people boycotted them. Boycotted them because the Catholic priests, and not without some reason, insisted that was the first step towards making Lithuanians Russian Orthodox, to learning Catholic faith in Lithuania. And to that Lithuanian peasants could not agree. So a very big, for that era, a very big Tamizdat project was arranged in Ostpreußen, in Germany, German Empire, mainly in the city of Tilsit. Now the city of Tilsit is called Sovietsk. It is in Kaliningrad region. It is inhabited mainly by Russians. But at that time it was a German-speaking city. Probably 10 to 15% of population spoke also Lithuanian. They were Lutherans, not Catholics. But that was a good business. They printed books in Tilsit in forbidden Latin alphabet, and then brought it by, как контрабанда по-английски? I would say underground networks into Lithuania proper, into Catholic Lithuania. At first, mainly the prayer books, but then also literature. Lithuanian literature was born in Tilsit. And poets appeared, prose writers appeared, at least 2 important newspapers appeared, and in 40 years, from the year 1864 to the year 1904, in 40 years, Lithuanian literature was born. Thanks to that idea, it was born in a foreign country, written by Lithuanians, mainly, if not exclusively, living in Lithuania proper. But they leaked their manuscripts to Tilsit. They were published there, and then by underground network brought back to Lithuania. It was by the way, it was a very, very good business, but a very dangerous one. Very dangerous one because people could be arrested. They could be shot while crossing the border. Then, if they crossed successfully, which was the rule, they could be arrested. People who bought the books in the forbidden Latin script were also, as a rule, arrested and got, as a rule, some fees to pay. But people who brought the books from Tilsit could be sent, not necessarily to Siberia. Some of them were sent to Smolensk region. Some of them even to Chisinau, which is not the very worst place for exile. But, good climate, good wine, and so on and so on. But still that wasn't the exile, and people suffered. Some of those underground businessmen were exiled for several times in a row. Sometimes it take more than 10 years. But still, it was an unwinnable play for the Tsarist authorities. An unwinnable play. The books were more and more numerous. Nobody bought the books which were distributed officially in Cyrillic letters, nobody. They became very rare. Then the authorities stopped publishing them because nobody bought them. And the underground network of Tamizdat, of Lithuanian Tamizdat, of Tilsit Tamizdat, became really mighty until the year 1904. Then the Tsar Nicholas II, later shot by the Bolsheviks, had a hunting party in the Belovesh forest in Belorussia. And the two governors, the general governor in Vilnius, whose name was Svetopolk Mirski, his son wrote a famous textbook of Russian literature. Later, he came back to the Soviet Union and was killed by Stalin. But that was the son. The father was general governor of Vilna or Vilnius. And other person, Verovkin, who was a governor of Kaunas or Kovno. His daughter was Marian Verovkin, a famous expressionist painter, one of the best expressionist painters, friend of Kandinsky, and so on and so on. So, during that hunting party, both governors approached the Tsar and said, "Your Majesty, it does not make any sense. This secret network of book publishing and book consuming becomes as mighty, and we cannot influence it. We cannot censor those books. We cannot do anything with them. Only arrest those people, but we know for sure that approximately 15 to 20% are arrested, and 80% remains in the hands of the people." It simply does not make sense. And since that was not a law, not a written law, but just a spoken directive, it could be very easily revoked. And it was revoked. The next day, Lithuanian literature became a real literature. In Vilnius, the first Lithuanian newspaper started. There were enough of journalists, enough of writers, enough of political leaders to produce that newspaper. Then hundreds of books were printed, including school textbooks, including novels, including poetry collections, including everything. Lithuanian culture was born during that period of banishment, during that period of when the Latin script was forbidden, during that period. And and after the year 1904, it immediately appeared on the historical scene as a relatively mature literature, relatively mature political movement, relatively mature culture, which in 14 years after that, in 1918, that resulted in Lithuanian independence, which we are once more enjoying now. So that's a very unusual, I would say, story of one of the most counterproductive decisions ever made by any government. They got definitely the opposite of what they wanted. The divergence between Lithuanians and Poles took place. That was one of the goals of the Tsarist government. But there was no change of Lithuanian position towards Russia and towards Russian Empire. If it was, it became even more pronounced and more independent, I would say, for those 40 years. So this is the story I can tell you, and it's a rather interesting story, I would say.
Indeed, thank you. This is it absolutely unique? Do you know any other literatures, national literatures and cultures that had at least anything similar, maybe not to such an extent, but when you want to ban literature in the national language, you get it?
Yes.
Instead of
well, the situation in Latvia and Estonia was different. They never banned the Latvian or Estonian print and never tried to force Latvians and Estonians to use Cyrillic letters. So they were printing Latvian and Estonian books for those 40 years. In Finland, it was even better. There was a real autonomy. But in Ukraine, the books and even notes in Ukrainian language were banned during the same period and printed mainly in Austro-Hungary, in Lviv or Lviv, which was called Lemberg, even in Vienna, even in Prague, and so on. And it was similar to Lithuanian situation, just similar. I still insist that the Lithuanian situation was rather unique. And the same with Belarusians. Belarusian language was forbidden. Books can be printed only in Russian language. That was worse than in Lithuania. In Lithuania, only the script, the Latin lettering was forbidden, but not the language. Belarusian language was forbidden as such. Ukrainian, more or less, also. And Belarusians, the early Belarusian writers started also to print their books in Austro-Hungary. But that was a very minor publishing enterprise in Belarus. And Belarusian culture started to develop only after the revolution of 1905. That means when there was no more ban on Belarusian language. Belarusian poets, Belarusian prose writers, Belarusian scholars appeared after the year 1905. Most of them were, by the way, socialists, and even leftist socialists. Many of them tried to find later common language with the Soviet authorities. And in the 20s it looked that it could go. But later virtually all of them were destroyed by Stalin, and Belarusian culture as such was virtually destroyed. Only now it is reappearing, and slowly, and with many problems, I would say. The same with Ukraine. I can also tell one more story about Moldova or Moldavia. Moldovans, well, their language virtually does not differ from Romanian language. And they used Latin letters, like Romanians use. They were, by the way, were and still are Orthodox, like Russians and Romanians, not Catholics like Lithuanians, and not Lutherans like Latvians and Estonians. They were Orthodox. And Moldavian or Moldovan culture was, well, always considered part of Romanian culture. When Moldova or Bessarabia was annexed by the Soviets in 1940, Stalin did the same thing which did Alexander II. He forbade Moldovan Latin script. Books could be published and should be published in Moldavian language, but in different script. And the language was, there was a claim that it is a different language, that it differs from Romanian at least as much as Belarusian from Russian. And it was called Moldavian language. Also, 40 to 50 years, only Cyrillic script was used in Moldova, only Cyrillic script. They did not arrange any tamizdat enterprises, so they did not repeat the Lithuanian experience. But now they came back to the Latin script. There is a legend. I am not so sure that it is true. There are many such legends about Stalin. That in the year 1945 or something like that, Stalin was approached by some of Russian ideologists and even by scholars, and told that Joseph Vissarionovich, we think that Lithuanians could use Russian script, Cyrillic script. This Latin script is Western, that means it is a bit suspicious, and so on and so on. We fight the Western influences in the entire Soviet Union, and here you have the Western influence in any letter. And according to the legend, Stalin answered, I have heard that once we tried it, but it was unsuccessful. Don't do it. Let them write in Latin script. The problem is that they should write Soviet literature, but in Latin script, which was done. So this second attempt was unsuccessful because Stalin himself was opposed to it. But this is a legend.
I noticed that you still use the word tamizdat even when you talk about the 19th century, after 1863, what gave Lithuania its literature. But also, so this is a historic kind of extension right back into history, but also linguistically. What were these books called? How did people talk about them? So when one receives a book from Tilsit, what do they tell each other? What kind of book did they get? So it's a terminological question. How did they exist as a phenomenon that people knew about in the Lithuanian language among same book smugglers and readers and even authors? And then is there a Lithuanian word for a cognate for tamizdat?
No. There is a Lithuanian word for those underground contraband sellers, knignešai, which means people who bring the books, who carry the books. It was as I have said, it was a rather profitable business, but at the same it was a very hard work physically. They usually brought the books in mishki, in sacks, weighing approximately 20 kilos, which was, well, you have to be a strong man to do it. And then it was, of course, this danger. But those book bringers, booksellers were national heroes. And in Kaunas you have a monument to an unknown soldier, and next to that monument, a monument to an unknown bookseller. So it is a phenomenon of Lithuanian history, yes, even recognized by the UNESCO as a rare phenomenon in cultural development. A special term like tamizdat, no, I don't think that there was a special term for it. Just telling, well, books brought by book bringers, by booksellers. Also the term knignešystė, which can be also translated as book bringing, book selling, secret book selling. We had a sort of a repetition of that same process during the Stalin times, during the Soviet times in Lithuania. Well, just like in Russia, or Ukraine, or Latvia, Estonia, and so on. We had it, but about that we will probably speak a bit later.
Well, we can start moving towards this period already. And before, maybe we can try to propose a term like this in Lithuanian right here with your help. After all, it's a poetic, almost new word that a poet would invent, maybe, such as, or collectively. Anyway, we will get to this. But
well, we managed to invent a word for samizdat. Samizdat was translated into Lithuanian, and it was used and still is used. We used it in the Lithuanian underground, and we still use it in the historical books. Savilaida, which is the literal translation of samizdat. Sam is savi, izdat is laida, savilaida. But there is no such term for tamizdat. Tan laida, tani laida, I don't feel that it could be accepted by the masses, so to speak. Don't think so. I don't have such a feeling.
So when the term tamizdat, I think as well, or samizdat is older, this goes back to the 40s, to like Nikolai Glaskov, but tamizdat is much younger, and maybe it wasn't even used widely even in the 1970s, which is when it so happens that your first texts were leaked, as they say, or smuggled out abroad and published somewhere else while you were still living in Vilnius or in Moscow and Leningrad at the time. So could you tell us about the first tamizdat story that you were part of as an author, personally?
Well, that's a difficult story because such a story is virtually non-existent. First of all, to tell something about the term samizdat, about the idea of samizdat. In Russia, samizdat is a very old phenomenon. There was samizdat in the 19th century. There was, you know that Lermontov's Demon was printed first, I believe, in Karlsruhe. Or Pushkin's, some of Pushkin's works were also printed tam in the foreign countries. By the way, part of that Russian samizdat was simply the obscene poems, sometimes quite funny, Barkov and so on. One of the writers of that period even wrote a poem, even produced a short poem of 4 lines. I cannot tell every line, but I will try to give you some idea. «Пишу стихи я не для дам, все больше о том о сём. Я их в цензуру не отдам, а напечатаю в Карлсруhe». I write poems not for the ladies, mainly about such and such things. I will not bring them to the censorship, but I will print them in Karlsruhe. The city of Karlsruhe, for some reason, was famous for printing such mainly Russian, but not only Russian books. I think some of this Ukrainian tamizdat, some of this Belarusian tamizdat was also printed in Karlsruhe. They had printers who knew East European languages. So, and of course there was samizdat throughout the entire Tsarist period. And then throughout the Soviet period, from the very beginning, from the year 1917. Lots of books were printed abroad. For example, the immense enterprise in Berlin, Tsvetaeva, Nabokov, early Nabokov, Khodasevich, Bunin, even Maxim Gorky, lots of people printed their work in abroad, and then it leaked to the Soviet Union. Sometimes almost by official channels, but rarely, rather by unofficial channels. And in Stalin times it became really dangerous. Now speaking about the Lithuanian samizdat during the Soviet period. That's also a long story and interesting story, because in the year 1940, Lithuania, just like Latvia, Estonia, and Western Ukraine, Western Belarus, and Moldova, they all were annexed by the Soviet Union. Approximately a year, it was so-so. It was, so to speak, bearable. Many people even thought that it was much better than to become the part of the Nazi Germany. And yes, in some respects, it was better. But in the June of 1941, big deportation started. People were deported. They were given 2 hours for preparing themselves, the entire families. And they were allowed to take 100 kilos of things with them, but were warned that since part of the way you will walk, don't take too much. So, and then they, after several very difficult months, They found themselves in Altai region, in Krasnoyarsk region, in Yakutia and so on. Not only ethnic Lithuanians, by the way, but lots of Poles, lots of Jews, lots of Russian immigrants, which were numerous in Kaunas at that time. All of them were considered, sometimes not without some reason, as enemies of the Soviet regime. 17,000 were deported. 17,000. That was never brought to the public attention. Never any information about that was printed in the newspapers and so on. So people at that time people understood that Soviet regime is something one should avoid, to put it mildly. And in 1944, at least half of the Lithuanian intelligentsia emigrated, at least half. There were probably approximately 60,000 of Lithuanians managed to leave Lithuania in 1944, together with the German army, not together, but so to speak, following in the steps of the retreating German army. At first, they found themselves in German camps for the displaced persons, and later most of them managed to move to the United States. So you have 60,000 of new Lithuanians in the United States. I think approximately 30,000 of Latvians, 20,000 of Estonians, probably hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, and so on. The so-called DPs, displaced persons. Some of them, now, well, there is a usual Soviet idea that they were Nazis. I would say 10 to 15% of them probably were. But most of them were not. There were even leftists. And approximately half of the Lithuanian intelligentsia found themselves in Chicago, in Los Angeles, in New York, where they had to change their work. Very many of them became simply proletarians. Although in Lithuania they were, let us say, school teachers or university professors or famous writers and so on and so on. Very small number of them found employment which was according to their education. Most of them did not know English. Well, later, of course, they learned English. And their sons and daughters became, more or less regular Americans. But 60,000, it does not look very big number, to be a very big number, but there was half of Lithuanian writers, more than half of Lithuanian painters, half of theater actors, half of musicians, half of university professors, and so on. So they tried to do their best and to arrange newspapers, magazines, publishing enterprises, and so on and so on. It can be compared to Russian situation in Berlin in the 20s, when Tsvetaeva or Bunin or young Nabokov were active. More or less the same situation. These magazines even paid some honoraria, very small ones, but they did pay. One could find an employment in those newspapers and survive. Just not in the best way, but for some people it was better than to do strictly physical work. And there were very good writers, some of them, not everybody. Also, as usual, there were lots of gravomaniacs and so on. But there was, for example, a poet, Radauskas, who was at least as good as, let us say, Chodasevich. at least as good. Not, I would say, not as good as Mandelstam, but almost. Very, very good poet. He died in Washington, D.C. in the year 1960, I believe, or 1970. In the year 1970, he was 60 years old. I met him once in my life, not in America, in Lithuania. During the Nazi occupation, he visited my mother. They were on friendly terms. So, and I remember him. I was 55 years old, but I remember Henrikas Ladauskas. For me, it is a very big, very important experience. Henrikas Ladauskas, then Škėma, who wrote a fiction, a novel about his own experience. He was working as a person in in an elevator in one of the posh New York hotels. And he wrote that experience of an elevator worker, using the methods of Joyce and of French existentialists and so on. Recently, his novel was translated into German, and it had success. It was very successful. Critics wrote in Germany that if it were translated in the 40s, immediately after the war, when it was written, it could become one of the big European novels of that period. Now it is simply too late. But people read it, and they read it in Lithuania. So all that tamizdat, there was also very big tamizdat, just like in Tsarist times, a very important literature, and it leaked to Lithuania. It leaked to Lithuania, those newspapers, those magazines. It was difficult. It was a bit dangerous, not extremely dangerous, I would say. But if you were found reading that literature, you could be included into so-called blacklists, which means very much lesser possibilities of good employment and so on and so on. So, and of course, the entire my generation read that literature. We read also Russian tamizdat. We read Mandelstam, we read Gumilev, we read Akhmatova, which leaked from the West. We read, for example, Nadezhda Mandelstam's memoirs. For me, that was a very important reading. But we also had this entire large literature in Lithuanian, which was sometimes good, sometimes not so good. But at least it was free. It was something different. It was something interesting for that reason. We read it. We distributed it. We gave it to each other, saying, well, I gave it to you for one night. I hope you will manage to read it in one night. Sometimes it was a big novel. So we managed to do it. In the same way, we managed to read, for example, Camus. The Plague by Camus. I was given it in Polish translation for one night. And of course, I managed to read it in one night. Later, I was given Solzhenitsyn's In the First Circle, w Krugu Pierwszym, also for one night. It was more difficult than Camus, because it is longer, and Camus is better. But still I managed to read it, and not without some interest, and even enjoyed it. So we got that. Then some people in Russia started to leak their manuscripts to the West. Shalamov, Voinovich. Well, you had, I believe, the entire class on that, so you know the problem. It happened in Estonia. In Estonia, there was an old poet and scholar whose name was Uku Masing. He started his work in Tartu in the 20s. Then in the Soviet period he somehow survived, but never printed his work. We used to say about him that he is not anti-Russian, he is anti-Indo-European, because Estonians are an Ugrophonic people, they are not Indo-Europeans, and they generally consider, not they of course, not every one of them, but there are people who consider Indo-Europeans to be a group of people which is aggressive and dangerous for Ugrophonic people. Ugo Mazink was one of them. He wrote religious poetry, philosophical poetry. He was a good writer, well, not a bad writer, to tell the truth. And he managed to leak some of his work outside, and it was printed in Sweden. And nothing happened. Nothing happened to Ugo Mazink. So, but in Lithuania, everybody said, well, those censors, those party leaders, those occupiers, those Russians, they are simply killing our culture. Something should be done. But what? Well, the logical answer would be try to leak your work to Chicago, to New York, to Los Angeles. There are magazines, there are newspapers, there are printing houses in Lithuanian language. Try to write everything you want to and to leak it. Russians are already doing it. Some Ukrainians are doing it. One Estonian has done it. So why we should be worse than those people? So, well, I tried to leak some of my work into one of those magazines. There was a magazine, by the way, it was a rather leftist. In any case, it was not a strictly rightist one. No, absolutely not. Not a fascist one. The name of magazine was namai-muziejus. It was just a very intelligent, a very intellectual enterprise. They printed scholarly works, they printed modernist poetry, they printed modernist short stories, and so on and so on. And it appeared as a rule twice a year, and it was of the size almost like November, almost, but only twice a year, and it leaked to Lithuania. We read it. So I tried to send some of my poetry to namai-muziejus. But it stopped at the border. I don't know why. We never knew those ways of transmitting our work to the West. The only thing I managed to print in the West was a journalistic piece, an essayistic piece. Not strictly with Lithuanian press, it dealt with Jewish press. There was a Jewish underground magazine, Tarbut, in Moscow, edited by my friend Felix Dektor, who knew Lithuanian, who was from Vilnius. He was a Vilnius person. And Felix Dektor printed their memoirs of one of Jewish people imprisoned in Nazi times in Kaunas ghetto, and told me, well, it would be good to have also a Lithuanian voice. Could you write something, sort of an answer to that Jewish voice, sort of a dialogue? You are known as an anti-Soviet person. At that time I wrote a letter asking for the permission to emigrate because I don't subscribe under the Soviet ideology, and because of that reason I cannot be published. And I don't imagine another work for myself, only writing and publishing. So after that letter I was definitely an enemy of the people and an anti-Soviet personality, but still here in Vilnius. And so doctor said, well, you are already well known because of your letter. Write something on that topic. I wrote an essay, Jews and Lithuanians, which was printed in Tarbut. Tarbut was leaking to the West all the time, to Israel, not only to Israel, and it appeared also in Western press, including Lithuanian press. Well, since it was, the usual position of the Lithuanian nationalist was, we are okay. We never did anything to Jewish people, quite vice versa. Jewish people were in their majority communists, so sometimes from time to time, maybe some rather stupid Lithuanian could do something, as revenge for Jewish communist crimes. But that's all that can be told about that. All the Jewish people were killed by the German Nazis, and no one Lithuanian is guilty. So that was the regular émigré position. And the position, the latent position, never told publicly, but typical for lots of Lithuanian intelligentsia here in Lithuania. I wrote something different. I wrote that, well, there were crimes, and we must confess to those crimes. That was printed in the West. It leaked to those Lithuanian émigré magazines. Some of the Lithuanian émigrés, for example, there was a famous semiotician, French semiotician, who was of Lithuanian origin, Algirdas Julian Greimas. There was Vytautas Kavolis, who taught philosophy at the Dickinson College, was a rather known American intellectual on the American level. So Greimas, Kavolis, some else told me that, well, we agree with you, we subscribe to your essay about Jews and Lithuanians. But lots of Lithuanians disagreed. Not many voices were public, but you could feel it, this underground movement that, well, Ventslova is not okay. Ventslova should be condemned because he takes not our side, but Jewish side. And that is, well, just like during the, well, excuse me for the comparison, but it's like this, the basketball match. You are not on the side of Vilnius, but you are on the side of Tel Aviv. How can you? Every Lithuanian must be on the side of Vilnius, no matter what. So there was that feeling. I even believe that the Communist Party of Lithuania, it influenced the Communist Party of Lithuania. Let him go. Let him go. The emigres will not accept him. The emigres will reject him. He will become unemployed and poor and so on and so on. He will understand everything, and that will be our big victory. So, well, thank God I did not try to make my career in the Lithuanian emigre circles. I was active in them, telling the same as usual, but never tried to do any career there. I tried to do an academic career in an American university. There, this my position could do no harm, absolutely. And, well, on the other hand, my American colleagues even did not know about my position. Mainly they were not concerned about it. They were concerned about my practical possibilities. Do I know who was Baratinsky? Do I know who was Georg Ivanov? Yes, I knew that. They accepted me. And gradually, very gradually, I became an American professor with bad English, but still an American professor. So the party authorities failed because their daydream did not come true. I never became a rejected person in the United States, rather vice versa. So that was my only experience with Tamizdat. This article, this essay about Jewish-Lithuanian question, which is still reprinted. It is still reprinted in several countries and in several languages. But I would tell that I wanted and still want my poetry to be printed. Well, it is now it is printed in English and other languages, but that would be more important for me than my essays. But my only Tamizdat experience is with that essayistics.
Couple of more questions, and then I hope we can also open it up to yours. When you emigrated in '77, did it feel... So when you just said that this was your only experience, participation in Tamizdat, you did not mean that emigre literature written by emigres who already live there where their works are published is Tamizdat. So it's kind of a formal terminological definition. So is Tamizdat for you only what's written here and published there, or do you also include emigre?
They definitely includes. Well, I would add something. Which I told, what I told is about my experience with Lithuanian Tamizdat. And I had also some experience with Russian Tamizdat. My poems leaked to the West, and one of them was translated by Joseph Brodsky. And Joseph Brodsky, there was a Russian emigre magazine, a very important in its own times, Continent. Brodsky published my poem. I was still here in Vilnius. Brodsky published my poem in his translation in Continent. And, Continent was a strictly inimical enterprise from the Soviet point of view. And to be published in Continent, that was something terrible, absolutely terrible, from the Soviet point of view. But moreover, there was a cover for the Continent giving the photos of the main authors. So there was Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Milovan Džilas, and Tomas Venclova. A very, very good company, too good for me. But after that, the Soviets probably decided that, the choice is clear. Either we give him 15 years of imprisonment, or we throw him out. Where he will be unsuccessful, he will ask for coming back, and so on and so on. It probably makes more sense for throwing him out. After that, Continent leaked to Lithuania and was read by some people here. Well, to tell you something about the Aesopian language. You know, there is a poem, a very famous poem by Adam Mickiewicz, the first line of one of his Crimean sonnets. It is as famous in Polish literature as Mój dziadzia samych czesnych prawil in Russian literature, the first line of Eugene Onegin. So it sounds, wpłynąłem na suchego przestwór oceanu. I sailed into the dry ocean. Dry ocean means Ukrainian steppe. Ukrainian steppe, and it could be also understood as continent. So when I got this number of the Continent into my hands here in Vilnius, not in this apartment, I had a different apartment at that time, but very close by. I called by phone my friend, now unfortunately deceased, Pranas Morkus, and said him by phone, I sailed into the dry ocean. So he understood what it was about. There was also a very similar story with Polish tamizdat, because I also found my work in the Polish tamizdat. The best-known Polish emigre magazine was Kultura. Kultura in Paris. Very influential, very good, by the way. And Czesław Miłosz translated one of my poems and printed it in Kultura, in Paris Kultura. It was called Paris Kultura, Kultura Paryska. So he printed it there. And I got a letter from Poland. Dear Thomas, finally I know that you are a good poet, because I read a translation of your work made by a very good poet, by the way. I can only congratulate you. I think it's quite okay. Then I wrote a letter to that Polish friend in Krakow. Well, I am happy that my work has been translated into Polish. I even can guess who the translator is. That was Czesław Miłosz. But I would like to know where it was published. I suspect that it was published in one quite cultural city. Cultural, that for the Kultura city is Paris. And I got an answer. Yes, you are right. It was published in a cultural city. So, now I see that you asked me about my own experience in tamizdat. So in Lithuanian tamizdat it was minimal. But in Russian and Polish it was less than minimal. It was perceptible. When I arrived to Paris, it happened approximately a month after my publication on Continent. Of course, I had no money and so on. I was in a difficult condition. I went to Continent and said, you just published my poem. Where is my fee? They answered, Континент не платит никогда никому и ни под каким видом. Continent does not pay anybody, anytime and anyway. So, Brodsky, for example, Brodsky published the entire book of poems. And we knew, he was informed that he had a honorarium, a fee for that book, $4,000, which await for him at such and such Western bank. That was the year 1972 or something like that, 1972, and we thought, we were in Leningrad at that time, $4,000. What an immense sum. How happy is Joseph Brodsky. And so on and so on. Now we know that 4,000 is not an immense sum. At that time it was a bit better than now, but still a very, very modest sum. Mm-hmm. But Continent did not give me a cent.
There is a story that you told me once about an Israeli journal much later, not choosing Lithuanians, but was it 22, who told you that мы не обязательно печатаем гоев, но изгоев всегда.
Да. But how to translate it in English? But they also did not pay.
Особенно гою. Do you keep an eye on Medusa books, Freedom Letters, whatnot? What do you think about the future of this new tamizdat, or maybe about its past?
Well, we'll see. You reminded me of my also deceased friend Joseph Stumelis, who was invited to the KGB and asked by them, what do you think about your future? He answered, I think mainly about my past. And okay, He was extremely witty man. When Alexander Ginsburg came to Vilnius, one more story about tamizdat or samizdat. Alexander Ginsburg came to Vilnius and said us that I am organizing an unofficial poetry magazine, Syntax. I would like to arrange not only Russian issues but also issues in other Soviet languages. The best poets in the Soviet Union, as far as I know, are Georgians and Lithuanians. So there will be a Georgian issue and a Lithuanian issue. Would you like to participate? We try to participate. That's a different story and an interesting story. But Tumelis said, young man, before working on syntax, you should study phonetics and morphology. And after syntax, you will definitely study geography. That means you will be deported. And he was absolutely right. But that was a joke. That was a joke because Tumelis took some part in syntax. Now, speaking about today's situation, I am not very well acquainted with today's situation. My own book, History of Lithuania, I wrote a big 2-volume History of Lithuania, and it has been translated into Polish, and it will appear in Poland probably within a year. Now it has been also translated into Russian. But it is simply a daydream to think that it could be published in Russia. If only for the reason that there is a law, a written law, that one cannot compare Stalin's regime with Hitler's regime. Simply. It's incomparable. Well, it is, in a sense, it is incomparable, but in a different sense. But you cannot compare it. Stalin is more or less okay, and Hitler is absolute evil. You cannot tell that Stalin is also evil, cannot tell. So in my book, I compare those regimes. I say that Stalin is virtually as evil as Hitler. I tell it. And that has been translated into Russian. The manuscript does exist. But if it would be published in today's Russia, the publishing house and the translators would suffer, definitely. For that reason, it seems that it has to be published somewhere outside of Russia. There are such enterprises. I don't know much about them, but there are such enterprises. I hope that it will be published in Russian as well, because knowledge of Lithuanian history written by a Lithuanian, I hope more or less a competent Lithuanian, would be useful for the Russian-speaking public, would be definitely useful. So, for example, today I told you some stories from Lithuanian history, and for some of you it was definitely something new. So there are, I bet there are hundreds of such interesting stories in Lithuanian history. So, well, there are emigre enterprises. We are trying to contribute to them. I myself contributed to several emigrant enterprises in Montenegro, in Czech Republic, in Switzerland, somewhere else. Well, the same, of course, problem with the translations from Ukrainian. I have some, how to say it, some separate opinions about the Ukrainian cultural policy. But about that I will not tell you much, because it's a very sensitive problem, and Ukrainians, generally speaking, have right to their policy. But in my opinion, well, yes, that some tamizdat does exist and must exist in today's Russia, some tamizdat, like it existed in the Soviet period. Moreover, there is internet, which did not exist in the Soviet period. And to tell me once more about my Lithuanian history, I was told today that one chapter of my Lithuanian history is already available in the internet. Unfortunately, only one chapter. But maybe the entire book will be there. Let's hope so.
Я задам вопрос по-русски, чтобы нас не подозревали в отмене русской культуры.
Я говорю всегда в таких случаях, перейдем на язык оккупанта.
Агрессор. Да. Сегодня можно перейдем
Теперь можно сказать агрессора.
На язык агрессора. Да. Насколько диссидентские движения в республиках советских в большей степени они были антисоветские или в большей степени они были все-таки национально окрашены? Так скажем, пролитовские, понимаете, да? Я не хочу быть националистические, да? Но чего больше было вот именно в частности в литовских, да? В литовском диссидентстве?
В той мере, в какое это движение было в подполье, оно было национальным и, как вы говорите, националистическим.
Я не говорю.
Ну, в общем, упомянули этот термин. Оно было национальным и националистическим. Но вот я даже шутил. Вот появилась католическая подпольная газета. Какая у нее программа? «Русские вон из Литвы». Появилась подпольная народная газета Народной подпольной партии. Какая у нее программа? «Русские вон из Литвы». Появилась социал-демократическая газета, программа «Русские вон из Литвы». Появилась еврокоммунистическая газета, программа «Русские вон из Литвы». То есть не было другой программы. Мне это казалось немного провинциальным, мне это казалось немного мешающим Литве, поскольку я считал, что если это рухнет, то только общими усилиями. Сами мы одни никогда не освободимся. Это совершенно невозможно. И, собственно, так оно и произошло. Мы освободились потому, вот сейчас любой скажет, любой литовский деятель скажет, конечно, Литва вела себя героически, мы там стояли у Сейма, там люди погибли, это все правда. Это все правда. Но мы сами все это сделали. К сожалению, ни черта бы вы не сделали, если бы что-то не происходило в это время в Москве. Сначала Горбачев, что бы о нем там ни говори, сначала Горбачев дал определенный сигнал. Ландсбергис, который без Горбачева остался бы рядовым музыковедом, стал национальным вождем. А потом в Москве начались митинги, 500 тысяч и больше человек. Свободу Литве. И русский народ в общем и целом был так положительно нейтрален. И только поэтому мы освободились. Сейчас, к сожалению, ситуация эта изменилась. Я не могу сказать, что русский народ сейчас положительно нейтрален. Я слишком мало знаю тамошнюю ситуацию. Тогда я знал. Тогда я бывал в России, тогда я варился в этом котле, я знал эту ситуацию. И я знал, что можно освободиться общими силами, но только общими силами. Когда наши сопротивленцы, они не любят, когда их называют диссиденты, они говорят, мы резистенты, мы сопротивленцы. Диссиденты – это разные марксисты, которые хотели сохранить Литву в составе Советского Союза. Ни черта мы не хотели. А что мы марксисты, может быть, кто-то и был там марксистам, и вообще Маркса почитать не мешает, господа, не мешает. Так же, как и Фройда, так же, как и Фрезера, так же, как и Адама Смита, не мешает. От этого, так сказать, хуже не станет. Это другой вопрос. Но мы сопротивленцы. Мы всегда были за Литву совершенно свободную, никаких русских. Но когда они попадали в лагеря, они там находили общий язык с русскими очень часто. С тем же Гинзбургом, с тем же Буковским. Буковский написал в одной статье: «Я националист. польский, чешский, нигерийский, индонезийский, таджикский, армянский, грузинский и так далее. Я ответил, я националист. Польский, чешский, нигерийский, армянский, таджикский, конечно, литовский, иногда даже русский. Такой был мой ответ Буковскому. Но я был большим исключением среди литовских диссидентов. Но опять повторяю, в лагерях они находили общий язык. Потом выходили из лагерей, опять забывали. Если бы не Людмила Алексеева, если бы не Сергей Ковалев, никакая литовская подпольная пресса не проникала бы за кордон. Она проникала благодаря помощи русским. Тогда, когда это все вот варилось в этом подпольном котле, это люди в общем понимали. Сейчас они перестали это понимать, и сейчас это напоминать даже считается как-то неуместным. И я очень сожалею об этом, потому что было, то было. И освобождались мы вместе. Правда, освобождались мы вместе, но вот кто-то освободился, а кто-то и нет. Русские, к сожалению, не освободились. Хотя был момент, когда я думал, ну вот уже наконец и они освободились, и слава Богу. Был такой момент.
Решили вернуться.
Решили вернуть. Ну, как-то не решили. Ну, за них решили, но они оказались слишком пассивными, чтобы это правильно принять.
Но насколько, когда я читала книги «Евромагнит», да, то, с одной стороны, вы себя чувствовали свободнее, когда вы уезжали в Москву. Там для вас ощущалось больше свободы. В обратную сторону Бродский, когда уезжал в Литву, он себя здесь чувствовал свободнее. Все-таки это объясняется, скажем, отсутствием присмотра со стороны органов, ну там КГБ, например, да? Или это все-таки объясняется какими-то другими, более продвинутыми, хотя Москва вам не нравилась, насколько я помню, как город, он не приносил вам удовольствия, да?
Как архитектура нет.
Да, но как ощущение свободы, насколько я помню, вам там было легче ощущать себя, чем при всей любви в Литве.
Что сказать на это? Ну, во-первых, несомненно, то, что вот это всевидящий глаз и всеслышащие уши, как сказал Лермонтов, что для меня они как-то менее чувствовались в Москве. Потому что, ну, в Вильнюсе я заметный человек, а в Москве совершенно незаметный. И в Москве КГБ есть что делать и без меня. А в Вильнюсе не очень. Вот. Ну, есть что делать, но все-таки, так сказать, можно и этим заняться, и даже нужно. С Бродским то же самое. Бродский уезжал сюда, вот как Пушкин и Лермонтов уезжали в Грузию. «Быть может, за хребтом Кавказа сокроюсь от твоих пащей, от их всевидящего глаза, от их всеслышащих ушей». В какой-то мере это было так. Другая обстановка, другие люди, другие знакомства. Ну, я одно могу сказать. Если бы Бродский поселился в Вильнюсе, оказался бы в ситуации, ну, скажем, Юрия Ефремова или там Феликса Фихмана, он был глубоко несчастен. И он, наверное, это понимал. А так вот приехать, да, тут вроде бы свободнее. Тут можно пойти на выставку своеобразную, можно пойти на спектакль своеобразный, можно пойти в кафе, которое выглядит иначе, чем московские рестораны, и поговорить с людьми, которые думают немножко иначе. Вот это было для него какое-то освобождение. А для меня все это уже настолько приелось, что, напротив, я в Москве видел больше интересного даже в этом подпольном искусстве. Что то, что в Москве было подпольно, в Вильнюсе не было подпольно, оно вылезало наружу. Но именно поэтому оно, в общем, теряло вкус. Очень часто. Очень часто. А в Москве оно приобретало добавочный вкус именно потому, что его давили бульдозерами. Вот так вот это было. Найти всякую запретную литературу легче, в общем, было там. Но здесь тоже можно было. Но здесь можно было издать, например, в литовском переводе Борхеса, а там нет, не проходит. Чуть больше себе позволить это можно было. То есть в политике нет. Даже меньше позволить себе можно, а вот в культуре можно было позволить больше. Что касается Борхеса, я помню, я принес Борхеса в литературный журнал, и редактор, покойный Альгимантас Балтакис, известный такой человек в те времена, меня спросил: этот Борхес часом не антисоветчик? Я процитировал Ильфа Петрова. Я сказал, ну он не то чтобы антисоветчик, ему просто не нравится Солнечная система. И Борхеса напечатали, а в России нет. Такие планы издательские, конечно, утверждались в Москве и все такое. И, скажем, если ты в план включишь Орвелла, ты, конечно, не позволят. А какой-нибудь Борхес, ну кто там его знает, даже как-то мимо глаз проходило. Это вообще были такие разницы климата. И это очень интересная тема, она совершенно не разработана. Но был разный климат в Литве, разный в Эстонии, разный в Грузии. Даже в Ташкенте был другой климат. После ташкентского землетрясения издали журнал, там, не помню, как он называется, типа «Правда Востока». Русский журнал в Узбекистане. И там был рассказ Бабеля, мой первый гонорар. Ну, во-первых, Бабель уже как-то нехорошо. Во-вторых, еврей тоже как-то нехорошо. В-третьих, это о проститутке, и там гомосексуализм упоминается. Ну, это уж совсем нехорошо. В Москве бы не прошло, а в Ташкенте прошло. В Ташкенте там какой-нибудь сидит узбекский цензор, который не слышал о Бабеле и даже не очень понимает, что такое гомосексуализм. Ну вот.
How come that you were brought up in such a pro-Soviet family, but you became dissident? I still remember your father, good-looking man, your mother, they were driven by state car, yes. And when did it happen that you decided to quit on this regime and to leave, which was extraordinary at that time? I quite remember.
Okay, well, my father was a very cautious man, but he was not a 100% pro-Soviet man, and mother as well. You told something about his riding in a state car. He never had a state car. He bought a car himself, he had it for several years, and then sold it, and then used taxis, only taxis, or sometimes even buses. But he was less privileged than people usually think. Then he had good library, which is preserved in this apartment. He had good library, including not only the Soviet books, I would say, mainly non-Soviet and even anti-Soviet books. And I read it from the early youth. I said once in one of my articles that the biggest mistake of Stalin was that he never banned the entire world literature. He banned more or less Dostoevsky. He banned Proust, he banned Joyce, he banned I don't know whom else, well, maybe Baudelaire and so on. But he never banned Cervantes, Shakespeare, Schiller. And all that world literature works in the anti-totalitarian direction, in the anti-Soviet direction, by definition. It cannot be otherwise. All that literature influenced me definitely from my very early youth, because I was a very avid reader. I read not only Lithuanian, I learned Russian enough, early enough, and Polish early enough, and I am very happy that I learned those two languages, which gave me some possibilities not every Lithuanian young man had. Russian and Polish languages helped. Now we say, well, Russification, no, Russian language was useful as well, definitely useful. It would be probably better to learn English or French, but if we cannot learn English or French, then Russian will do. because you can read the same literature, the same good literature in Russian and more of it. I also happened to have good friends in a high school. Good friends who in the beginning were also rather cautious and ambivalent concerning the Soviet regime, but who changed very fast. Romas Katilius, Pranas Morkus, Zenas Butkevičius, who taught me skepticism, who taught me principles of ethics, I would say, very important principles of ethics, and who knew more about Lithuanian history and Soviet history and world literature, world history probably more than myself, who know more about Stalin's regime and could tell it to me. And well, that helped, books and friends, mainly those two things. Now people also say, well, it was very easy for him because he was always defended by his father. The KGB would never touch him because he was his father's son. That's untrue. That's untrue. KGB could touch everybody, notwithstanding his father's position, and the son could be harmful for the father, but the father could not defend the son. A good example, Pavel Litvinov. Pavel Litvinov, well, he's still alive. He was one of the most important Russian dissidents. He was a grandson of Maxim Litvinov, of Stalin's Minister of Foreign Affairs. A much bigger guy, a much bigger nomenclatura person than Tomas Vенцлова. And Pavel Litvinov became a dissident and was imprisoned and got his share of problems, big share of problems. So, well, that probably all I can tell.
Спасибо огромное. Ачу.